All right, let's go ahead and resume. These are just a couple of more slides on these population changes, growing and shrinking Asia. Another way to look at it is to see what's happening to Japan, which has been so dominant, other than China, in East Asia. So 1960, again, it's just population, but of course Japan had much higher income per capita as well. So Japan was very large compared to most of the countries in Asia. Only Indonesia was similar. By 2000, Japan looks much less impressive. Excuse me. Indonesia by then is larger than Japan in population by a good measure, and other countries have started to catch up. Now, we start to look at 2040. No, that's still 25 years away. In your government jobs, you don't worry about things that far in the future. But it's still interesting to think about kind of the change since 1960. If we look ahead, Japan actually is a smaller country in population than the Philippines, and only a little bit larger than Vietnam, only about 1/3 the size of Indonesia. So Japan is shrinking very quickly relative to the rest of the Asian region. And by the end of the century, Japan will be, in population, just another small country. And given that Japan's rate of economic growth is modest, strong economic growth in other countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam will bring them much closer. So Japan will no longer be the economic colossus of East Asia outside of China. Instead, Japan will kind of fade toward normalcy, and many other countries should be as large and rich as Japan by century's end. So just in terms of trajectories in the future, the point I want to bring is simply that the world is changing fairly rapidly around us. 1980, 2000, 1980, Japan looked like the dominant force in Asia. Nobody in 1980 would have thought that 20 or 30 years later, China's economy would be larger than that of Japan, right? But after 1980, Japan all of a sudden went into its crash and lost decades. China suddenly took off under Deng Xiaoping, and within 20, 30 years, things had completely turned around. But now things could be turning around again. So Japan now is on a path to shrink even further, and this is kind of incredible shrinking China. These are the medium projections for China from the United Nations. There we go, that's the button. So this is the population of working age, and as this was a wonderful boost to China's economic growth for the last 30 years. Wow, workforce grew almost 100% in 30 years. Working age population, that's kind of the demographic dividend, okay? But it's now changed. It's going to shrink slowly till 2030, but then the shrinking really picks up speed. And by about 2060, population will be back to what it was 30 years ago. So this is a loss of about 250 million working age Chinese in the next 35 years. At the same time, look at what happens to the population 60 and older. This is what people mean when they talk about rapid aging. Population age 60 will grow from about 200, let's see, what is it now? Yeah, it's about 200, this is thousands, so about 200 million now, and will grow to about 400 million by 2060. 450 million, it looks like. So there's a very rapid growth here in the elderly population. Now, what does this mean for China's planners? My worst fear is that China will look at this and say, okay, by 2030, we're going to have a huge elderly population to take care of, and a much reduced working force. So right now, between 2010 and 2020, it's going to be as good for us as it ever gets. If we're going to push our influence in the world, build up our military strength, reestablish our position, now's the time to do it. So I expect that China will actually be fairly aggressive in the next 10 years because it's going to have to be thinking, all right, once we get to 2025, we're going to have a very large burden of health care and pensions for the elderly that they're not equipped for right now, and a much diminished young people's force of military age. Now that's strategically. Economically, China's going to be facing headwinds. Probably, this period of slight decline is not too bad. But once you get past 2020 and the decline in the labor force speeds up, China's economy will probably be strongly impacted as well. So, is this an opportunity? In a way it is. The opportunity is productivity is the solution. All the countries of shrinking East Asia will be looking for ways to boost the productivity of workers. And that means innovation and technology. Now, for the world as a whole, global labor force, this blue line represents the labor force in countries that are currently considered stable, meaning they rank as stable on the various indices of state fragility or state failure or state legitimacy or peace that have come out. There are a lot of indices about what parts of the world are stable, what are not. It's actually not that hard to figure out. So China, Europe, North America, parts of South America are pretty stable. Much of the Middle East, South Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa are not stable, right? So kind of high incidence of civil conflict, low levels of education, low levels of health care, those things. Now, this is what's happening to the labor force in fragile states. Virtually all of the growth in the world's labor force is taking place in states that are deficient in some ways in terms of quality of services delivered, quality of legal system, quality of security for property and persons. That's, to me, a very depressing thought. One can only hope that the quality of governance is going to improve in the world. Now, what do I mean by quality of governance? Let's have a discussion of democracy and governance, a topic that is of particular concern here in Hong Kong. Before we get there, let me finish a couple more slides. Now, this is not inevitable. This is not a forecast. This is simply a projection if things don't change. My hope is that many of these states that today are fragile and have fast-growing populations will have improvements in the quality of government, education, and services so that they move into the column of stable states. That is, if there's a change in governance, the blue line could go up and the red line could flatten out. That's what we have to hope for. Problem right now is that the quality of international governance institutions is failing. So the global climate negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere. World Trade Organization has been very effective, but the latest round, the Doha round, has gotten stuck. I hope that America will finish moving forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, although that's not a done deal yet. Integration in Europe may start to break apart in the next couple of weeks if a solution is not found for the problem of Greece. Africa showed how irresponsible it can be, and that South Africa hosted a meeting of African leaders in which the leader of Sudan, who is under indictment from the International Criminal Court, was allowed to attend and go home without being arrested. South Africa issued a warrant for his arrest the day he left the country. So the ability of international organizations to work to raise the quality of governance in the weaker states seems to be lacking, either the willpower or the understanding. And the United States' efforts to kind of strengthen weak states or spread stability have generally been disasters. backfired, made things worse. So it's clear what has to be done. We need to improve the quality of governance in countries with very large and fast-growing populations. But we don't know the best way to do that. We don't know whether trying to bring democracy to a country is going to be a good thing or a bad thing. The experience in Afghanistan and Iraq was generally disastrous. Europe is not looking like a great advertisement for transnational or democratic governance. Everybody talks about the democratic deficit. The elections in Great Britain produced a very strange result where the Tory party got about 40% of the popular vote, but a clear majority of parliamentary seats, something you have to be familiar with the British first-past-the-post system to understand. Seems bizarre to other parts of the world that have a representational proportional system. In the European Parliament, far-right populist parties enjoyed their greatest success in many years and have now formed a bloc. It's very strange. Within the European Parliament, there is now a bloc of anti-European parties. Two blocks of anti-European parties. So democracy doesn't look like it's being embraced as a great success, enlarging it. The United States has become famous for being dysfunctional, with Republicans and Democrats fighting against each other rather than fighting together for much of anything. So meanwhile, two of the most popular leaders in the world are Vladimir Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China. They have popularity, respect, authority. Seems like a more successful and attractive model. The Journal of Democracy, which is affiliated with the National Endowment of Democracy and has generally been a booster for democracy around the world, has published a number of journal articles and papers about the resurgence of authoritarianism. Seems very clear that over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly since the global recession, which struck particularly hard in the United States and Europe, the global prestige of democracy, the global admiration for Western liberal democracies has declined. The efforts of the United States to take action around the world have generally been criticized more than praised, although the U.S. work in fighting the AIDS disease in Africa was a huge success, often not remarked. What people focus on are the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. But nonetheless, the prestige of the United States as a global actor has clearly diminished in recent years. So we'll have to see what happens here. Maybe fragile states become stabilized by becoming more authoritarian. But there's reason to worry about that. But let me sum up before we go into this democracy issue. Here's what I see, the global dynamic of the 21st century. The developed nations, and this will mean Japan, Europe, even the United States, will have much larger populations of elderly and aged. Even the United States, which people say, oh, it's not a problem, don't believe it. The United States population will not be as old as Japan or Germany, but it will be much older than the United States has been for the last 40 or 50 years. And what's more, what makes the United States particularly different is that unless things change, the United States generally pays 2 to 3 times as much for health care as any other advanced country. And one thing that an elderly population is a very large consumer of health care. So the aging problem in America is not just a matter of the number of people over age 60, it's the cost of the healthcare services that they consume. And that is so disproportionate that the overall cost of aging in the United States is actually a bit more like Japan or Germany than you would think. So you'll have old nations. The other kind of bad news about the situation is that all of these countries are going into a more aged population at the time that they already have rather large government debts. Japan over 200%, many European countries close to 100%. And although it's true that those debts were run up during the recession, and they've since declined a little bit in some countries, it's not a good situation to go into when less of your population is going to be active and productive, and more of your population is going to be dependent on government spending. If you were going into that situation with reserves, that would be good. Then you could manage, right? And we have this illusion that some countries have built up reserves. For example, the United States, on paper, has a substantial reserve in the Social Security and Medicare systems that was built up by the baby boom population paying Social Security and Medicare taxes while not using those services. So right from age 35 to 65, you pay fairly high taxes for Social Security, Medicare, but it goes into US savings bonds, which is supposed to be the savings. But the US, like many other countries, they didn't use that reserve to buy tangible assets. They didn't buy land, they didn't buy office buildings, they didn't buy equities. They put it into government bonds, which, after all, a government bond is just a promise to pay a certain amount of money in the future. So the money that went into US government bonds is essentially the government saying, we promise that in the future, when those bonds come due, we will either raise taxes enough to pay the bonds or reduce our other obligations enough to pay the bonds. So in a sense, having that big reserve of bonds doesn't mean you have a large number of assets. Now, the bonds could be sold to the general market. But of course, if they're sold all at once, the price declines. So it remains to see about the elasticity. Nonetheless, even if the bonds are sold, the interest payments continue to have to be made. So it's still a problem that we don't really have reserves. We have debt. Now, those old and heavily indebted countries will be facing very young and probably chronically violent and unstable nations in Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. So the world that we're living in today is probably the beginning of the new normal. I talked about that earlier when I said we're going to be in a period of low global economic growth for 10 years because we have deleveraging, China changing its growth model, and aging in the developed countries, all of which are acting as kind of negatives or headwinds for global growth. But while global growth is slow, we still have rapid population growth in Africa, Middle East, parts of South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And those are young, ambitious populations that through the internet have all the information about how rich the rest of the world is and who want to catch up fast, but who are not going to be able to. And they're going to be living under governments that are, frankly, not very representative, not very effective. And so the likelihood is that there will be chronic violence and instability. Now, I say there while Russia and China are likely to move toward democracy based on their age structure. What do I mean by that? That's actually an interesting new finding, and I'll talk more about that later this week. Countries that have older populations, once you have a median age of 35, about 80% of the countries in the world that reach that median age have established democracies. Now, why that's true, I'll talk about later this week. But it's a very strong finding, and the reverse is also true. Countries with a median age 25 or less, almost all are unsuccessful at building democracy. It appears that a certain maturing of the population goes hand in hand with the ability to sustain a competitive democratic system. So you would think that Russia and China, because they are older populations, would be moving toward democracy, just as, say, South Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, Mexico have done. Problem is, in a world with a lot of conflict and where democracies look economically weak and aging, people are much more likely to continue to support an authoritarian government. As I mentioned, Putin and Xi Jinping are very popular right now, partly because their countries are doing well economically. China still, despite the slower growth, is clearly much richer than it was 10 or 15 years ago, and people remember. And even Russia, despite the sanctions and despite the difficulties, Russia made so much progress from 2000 to 2010 that Russians today are living better than they've ever lived in the history of the country. And it's quite evident. How many of you have actually traveled to Russia? Nobody. Oh, a couple. A few. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, Russia's rural areas are still somewhat underdeveloped, and the average income per capita is about half that of most European countries. But in a sense, it's like China. If you go to Beijing or Shanghai, you're in a first world country for the most part. And the same thing is true of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod. Russia has really done very, very well out of those oil revenues and strong central management. So Russia and China, if they were living in a world where democracies were, you know, strong, stable, economically successful, and they were lagging, there'd be a lot more pressure for them to democratize their government. But in a world where Russia and China feel that they're doing better economically under their current government than they would have under democracy, and in Russia, the memory of complete economic chaos, runaway inflation, devaluation under the Boris Yeltsin regime is still very strong. I mean, Russia is suffering under sanctions much less than it suffered under democratic governance. I don't like to say that, but truth is the truth. So in Russia and China, they're still attached to this. And as I said, the global institutions for responding to disorder are growing increasingly weak, illegitimate. That's one of the reasons China put forth organizations like the Greater Shanghai Cooperation Group, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Europe and the United States have still kept their stranglehold on the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations Security Council. But the reality of the world today is that among the 10 largest countries by either population or size of GDP, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria soon, those countries have no representation in the institutions of global governance. And so those institutions look fairly weak by comparison. Whereas even the BRICS organization, which has almost no coherence that I can find, exists mainly as a talking shop for Brazil and Russia and India and China and South Africa to persuade each other how important they are in the world, right? But it has credibility in part because the G7 and the United Nations are losing their credibility because they are so unrepresentative, right? I mean, the G7 doesn't include the 3 of the world's top 10 economies now. So how representative can it be? So all of this is very dispiriting. It's not a good dynamic to have to come into. What I tell people is, look, it's much better than being alive during the Depression or World War II. Those were really bad times, right? These are challenging. And if we can save the climate, innovate to create economic growth, improve the quality of education in Africa, build smart cities, turn Asia into the leading economic edge for the 21st century and develop a high quality of life for the population of Asia that Africans can then emulate, could be great. And that's the good scenario. It's not gone yet. It's just in danger. One of the problems is people don't like each other. So Europeans are deeply anxious about Muslims in their population. But that's not just them. In Myanmar, they're deeply anxious about Muslims, and the Rohingya are being terribly persecuted. Minorities in China, as you know, have issues in dealing with their situation and their rights. Minorities everywhere in the world are suffering. This is what's happening with the Muslim population in Europe. Now, the number of Muslims is not growing that fast, and the percentages are not that overwhelming. For Europe as a whole, the projection is that the Muslim population will grow from 8% to 10% over the from 2010 to 2030. Now, is that a reason for panic? to grow from 8 to 10%. I wouldn't think that's any reason to be deeply anxious, you know. So 9 out of 10 Europeans will still not be Muslim. It should be fine. But people are panicking. That's partly because Muslim immigrants are concentrated in cities. They're concentrated in younger age groups. So they are particularly visible in cities, and their children are very numerous in the schools. So that's one issue. The other issue is that in a proportional voting system, a 10% population group is enough to have an impact on elections. Now, so far, that has not generally been the case. But as Muslims become more integrated into the fabric and do start voting, they may have an impact on some issues. So far, one would think they would simply vote conservatively and vote for support of existing governments. That's generally what migrants have done. But Europeans are actually quite fearful. Values and ideologies are powerful things. They don't respond to the logic of numbers. So, for example, China, with 1.2 billion people, is very worried that the ideas of the 7 million people in Hong Kong about how to run a government and run life will somehow spread and infect people in China and cause a swing of disloyalty to the government in Beijing. Well, that's because the power of ideas is not just a matter of numbers. Ideas do spread. And people are concerned that the ideas associated with Islam, which have been given a very violent and anti-Western spin by the active Muslim warriors in the Middle East, people find very threatening to the West. So this is a conflict that needs to be solved. And this is what's really upsetting Europe, is that within European countries, there is something of a mixing bowl. The percentage of foreigners is actually going to get very large. Now, that's not immigrants from Northern Africa, all right? This is total foreign born. That means people born in other countries, including other European countries, Asia, Latin America, North America. You know, London, you go to London, it's hard to find a Brit in many parts of London, right? If you go from Paddington Station, everything is Arabic and Lebanese on the streets around Paddington. That's not unusual. Los Angeles has whole neighborhoods that are Korean. Other cities are becoming world cities. It's a good thing. People learn to live together. They learn to blend cultures. One of the things I've learned from studying world history is the countries that have enjoyed the greatest spurts of productivity in world history, going all the way back to ancient Rome, have been countries that were unusually open. They tended to be confident. They weren't frightened by foreign ideas. They saw foreign ideas as things that could make themselves stronger. Think of Japan all the way from Meiji to the 1980s. Japanese were always confident, but always open to taking whatever the best ideas they could from other countries, making it their own, and using that to build their strength. That's actually what the Romans did. It's what the Europeans did for a long time. It's what the United States did. And so this could actually be a very good thing if people weren't so darn afraid of it. Now, so the future, in a sense, is a mixing bowl world. There will be more people on the move. There will be people moving out of Africa into Asia, something that's somewhat unprecedented. But education, growth, movement of people, and capital will be global. The fact that Hong Kong has this great concentration of universities, it needs to expand and get even bigger, and needs to be a resource for China and the world. But security and economic growth will be harder to come by. It will require more sacrifices. By that I mean hard work and investment. We can't simply say, we have arrived at a rich society, let's indulge all the consumption we want, enjoy our wealth, continue using our assets. You can't expect that if you do that, you'll remain competitive very long in this world. This you'll feel very much in Hong Kong. Generational and regional and other identity cleavages will grow worse. Because let's face it, in a world where economic growth is 3%, not 4 or 5%, and where population is still growing in certain areas but not others, people will be fighting more for that growth. When the world is growing faster, you have a bigger pie to divide, and people are not so anxious about being left out. But today's younger generations are being left behind. Today's undeveloped countries are being left behind. And the regional tensions between growing and shrinking nations will get worse. So people of different nations will have to work together. I actually get a little frightened, when I hear a lot of the anti-mainland dialogue in Hong Kong. It's perfectly understandable because I can see all the reasons for tension over direction of government, volume of tourism, quality of goods and services, the tension of day traders, different outlooks. Still, the future of Hong Kong is to be a leading city in China and a leading city in Asia. If Hong Kong were to separate from China, you would lose your biggest stage on which you could have a great influence. I mean, what has happened, unfortunately, in the last 20 years is Hong Kong has fallen behind Singapore and South Korea in levels of education, levels of technical innovation, levels of productivity. Now, Singapore and South Korea have invested more in education, technical education, in building manufacturing for export. Hong Kong can catch up. And Hong Kong has one big advantage that Singapore and South Korea lack. And that is that Hong Kong is Chinese speaking and, in a sense, part of the Chinese market and Chinese community. So Hong Kong should have privileged access to mainland China compared to South Korea or Singapore, if they take advantage of it. If, on the other hand, Hong Kong kind of draws a wall around itself and tries to separate itself from China, then it's going to have to compete with South Korea and Singapore in global markets where it's already behind and has no particular advantages. That's not a good future. So in a sense, Hong Kong should leverage its ties to China and particularly to Guangdong for everything it can, although working together proves surprisingly difficult. And one of the curious things about human nature, it's often the people that are most alike that have the hardest time working together, right? I'm Jewish. Many of my friends in greater Washington, D.C. area are Turkish, Persian, other Muslim groups. We all get along fine in the United States. But in the Middle East, Persians, as Iranians, Turks, Jews, they all want to kill each other. In fact, their cultures and histories and languages and religions have much more in common with each other than between the Semitic and Christian groups or Semitic and Asian religions. But being in tight competition for resources, being at unequal levels of development, those differences get magnified. So in a sense, same thing with Hong Kong and China. Despite having so much in common, the differences that you have tend to get magnified and become obstacles to cooperation. So here's the simple answer. If you want a simple one, there isn't any, but the best I can give you is technology and investment in the young, including the young of Asia, the young of Africa, the young of Europe, may be the best and only answer, because we have no solutions for problems of this magnitude. This is a sense I'm echoing what Steve said this morning, even though I did this graph before, and that is that there is no solution to the problems that face us without technological and institutional innovations that give us new ways of responding to new problems. The world that we're moving into in this century is so different than the world we had from 1950 to 2000. That was a world of rapid population growth, global economy dominated by Japan, Europe, and North America, a world emerging from a devastating conflict in World War II with enormous opportunity to rebuild infrastructure and really major improvements in transportation, energy, coming online in fairly quick succession. But since 1980, that world was kind of disappearing without us realizing it. China was becoming a powerhouse. Japan was slowing down. Europe and America and other parts of the world started dropping their fertility so rapidly that they would become aging nations by the 21st century. So the balance of the global economy was tilting. We didn't realize it, but the climate was already under pressure from building carbon dioxide, and we've only begun to understand the depth of that problem. So we have new problems that require new solutions. Now, even philanthropy, I think, will be more valuable than ever. This is another area where Hong Kong actually could lead the world because of the history of philanthropy in Hong Kong and this large number of kind of well-endowed families and institutions. But that's a different debate. What is Hong Kong's role in all of this? You are officials, government leaders in one of the world's most cosmopolitan and globalized cities, a center for Asian and global education, a two-way window for China, a major center for philanthropy. It does hurt me a little bit that Singapore benefited a lot from Hong Kong philanthropy and building up a school of public policy, because this is something we should do in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong really has the potential to be a global model for quality of urban living. You have all the resources here already, I think. I mean, you have one of the world's best public transit systems. You have a model of high-density housing. You have water resources, forest resources, open space. Problem is how to put it all together, how to deal with inequality, how to deal with the struggle of democracy and government, which is in many ways still unrepresentative, how to deal with the shift from trade and finance to innovation. You don't even have an Innovation and Technology Bureau in your government yet, another way in which you've kind of fallen behind Singapore and South Korea. Hopefully that will be remedied within a few weeks, right? It's on the table. Maybe. All right. Anyway, so I think the path is fairly clear. Now let me say a few things about democracy, and then I'll open up just for the last half hour of questions. Here's what we know about democracy historically. The rise of democracy over the long term of history seems powerful and inevitable. So much so that democracy was basically unknown for most of human history except in small city-state and tribal confederations. All of the kind of sophisticated, large civilizations of the world became authoritarian empires. Chinese Empire, Mughal Empire, Roman Empire, European monarchies, and so on. Democracy as a system of national government for large territorial states did not really catch on until the 18th and 19th centuries. Yeah, the American Revolution started, but at the time it was seen as kind of an experiment. The French Revolution was seen as a disaster, and it was 100 years before democracy was fully established in France after 1870, but it reverted to monarchy and empire pretty much all the way from 1815 to 1870. Britain, although we like to think of Great Britain as a democracy, as you know from living under it in Hong Kong, it didn't always live up to the idea of being a democracy. It was a kind of an elite oligarchy. It still had a hereditary House of Lords until how long ago? When did it become non-hereditary?
Well, it's sort of fragmented. Firstly, they kicked out
the old,
hereditary peers.
yeah. But recently.
Yeah, last 10 years.
Yeah, last 10 years. So, you still had a monarchy, a hereditary upper house, along with the democratically elected House of Commons. So it was
appointed upper house.
Yeah, you still have an appointed upper house. So it's a mixed constitution, not completely democratic. Switzerland didn't have women's voting until the 70s. So democracy is very recent, but it has spread very strongly. So at the beginning of the 20th century, by far the majority of countries in the world were non-democracies. There were only about a dozen or two. At the end of the 20th century, there were only about 24 countries that were non-democratic, at least in partial ways. So all of Latin America is now democratic. Most of the countries of Africa have democratic constitutions. How well they work in practice is often debatable. But South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, the kind of large major countries, all have democratic elections to choose their leaders. India is a democracy. The Middle East and China and Russia are kind of the big holdouts. But democracy has spread fairly steadily. That said, there have been periods of reversal. So the 1930s and 1920s and 30s were a period of major reversals with the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe that led to World War II. It appears that we're now also in one of those periods of reversal where authoritarian regimes are becoming somewhat more numerous and stronger, and democratic regimes are seemingly weaker and less admired. The number of democratic regimes has not shrunk that much. So the reversal has been more ideological than not. Nonetheless, we're in what people refer to as kind of a democratic pause or an authoritarian resurgence or a democratic retrenchment. How serious is it? I don't know. I actually do expect that within another 30 years, both Russia and China will have competitive electoral democracies. Now, I say that for several reasons. One is their populations are becoming more mature, which is typical. The other thing is their economies are getting more privatized and more independent. One of the things that happens, I think, in democracies is that people become autonomous because they can count on markets and associations to meet most of their needs. They don't depend on the state for jobs, for information, for insurance. They still depend on the state for pensions, medical care, education. But they still have choices. They like to have choices. They don't want the government interfering so much. Given a choice between living under a functioning democracy and a functioning dictatorship, people prefer the freedom of a functioning democracy. And even in China, if you talk to people who were born before 1970, they feel that they are now far more free than they were before. That is, before 1980, people had no economic freedoms as well as no political freedoms. You couldn't choose where you worked. You couldn't choose where you went to school. You couldn't even choose who you married without permission of your boss and work team. Now, people in China, they can travel within China. They can travel abroad. They can choose their job. They can choose their careers. They can start a business if they want to. They can choose how to invest. They have the freedom to get rich. They have the freedom to associate with who they please, marry who they please. They don't have political freedoms, but they have so many more economic freedoms that they feel free. Now, this is not so true of people who were born after 1980 and have grown up essentially with economic freedom and are anxious to have more political freedom. Younger generation in China is a bit more restive, just like here. But I think you will see pressures for democracy build up. Right now, the fact that the global economy is slowing and people feel anxious, and the fact that the recent economic performance in both Russia and China was strong has made it possible for those governments to go forward. But you look at China, I would think that the government of China would not be so frightened of discussion of Western values, discussion of competitive politics, discussion of independence, of judiciary, discussion of human rights and universal values. They wouldn't be frightened of discussion of those things unless they felt that they would have had a lot of appeal, right? So I think they're fighting a losing battle. They are fighting a retrenchment. They're working hard. But in the end, when people become secure enough economically and in their person to have a choice, they tend to choose democracy. So I think that will happen. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. It may not even happen in 10 years. But I think it will happen eventually. In the meantime, what happens in Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong is clearly committed to democracy. I think that's true even of the pro-Beijing faction. They would not simply want Hong Kong to merge with China and come under the same system, because even the most conservative here, a lot of their economic wealth still is preserved by the particular legal system that Hong Kong enjoys. The problem is, how do you live with this 800-pound gorilla across the border that is very nervous about the system here? If I had an answer for that, that would be wonderful. But of course, I don't even live in Hong Kong, although I'm planning to move here, so I've been watching recently. So I can't tell you much about your society. These are problems that you need to solve. What I can say is that democracy seems to be the system that does give the best economic rewards and the greatest personal satisfaction over the long run, judging by the choice that people around the world have made. Is kind of, if you watch the evolution of government systems, there have been few or no cases of countries that had been stable democracies for a long time who voluntarily, without a crisis, chose to go back to authoritarian regimes and kept them. The only kind of long-established democracies who went back to authoritarian regimes in Europe did so after the Great Depression, in a period of crisis, stayed with it through a period of war, and then rejected that. Eastern Europe also rejected that in the 1990s. Latin Americans, long period of authoritarian and military rule, rejected it. So the evidence of history and politics around the world is that democracy is coming. The problem is democracy doesn't answer everybody's prayers, doesn't always make things better for everyone. Democracy is a difficult system to make work. Somebody asked me today about, doesn't democracy slow down decision-making in government? Yeah, and the answer is yes. The whole point of democracy is to slow down decision-making in government so that decisions are carefully thought about and bad decisions can be blocked or overturned. Now, is that a bad thing? It can be a bad thing. You can get to the point in the United States we are today where decision-making is so slowed down and blocked and where the legal system has become so entangled and overgrown that it's hard to do anything good or bad. Fortunately, because the government is limited, the private sector still goes on and does good things by itself. But could be better. So the thing about democracy in Hong Kong is democracy everywhere is a constant challenge in making the system work. Democracy is not something that runs by itself. Democracy is nothing more than a set of institutions that allow people who have different points of view to try and reconcile those different points of view to agree on a path of action. It's not even necessarily a path of action that everybody supports for the same reasons. But it is a system that blocks the worst and permits consensus on action to evolve. One of the nice things about democracy is that if the government takes an action that you disagree with, most people will still support that action if it came about through a legitimate process, because they know that if the process is preserved, they have the opportunity to change that decision in the future. Because the whole point about the process is that the process of democracy exists to limit government's authority and to make it possible to stop or change its decisions. But it doesn't automatically generate good decisions. If you have a brilliant, good leader who you put in charge, you can just sit back and say, okay, I appointed somebody to make all the decisions. And as long as they're good decisions, it's an automatic system for me. I don't have to worry about it. However, history doesn't show that those systems are indefinite motion machines. That is, if you give one person or one institution like the military, if you give them power to make all the decisions, they may do good for a while, but they eventually run out of good ideas. And if they've stopped listening to other people, then society runs out of good ideas. Good thing about democracy is everybody is empowered to offer their ideas, good or bad, and that way a variety of good ideas can be put forth and come to the surface. All right, now it's time for you to give me your good ideas, or questions, or comments. From the microphone.
Yeah, the increasing population in Africa, although it may be 30, 40 years later on, will that increase in populations actually deplete our natural resources? We fight for resources.
Yeah.
Will there be any regional instability?
The issue of instability is usually much more one of distributional fairness rather than level of resources. So we've had revolutions throughout history in poor societies and in much richer societies. You can have a fairly rich society where if one group feels they're not getting their fair share, they'll want to rebel. If many feel that they're being deprived by a corrupt elite, they will rebel. On the other hand, you can have a fairly poor society, but if resources are distributed in a way that people feel is just and equitable, that's okay. So the issue for Africa is much more a problem of corrupt leaders and ethnic groups that dominate a mixed polity. Both of those generate feelings that we're not getting our fair share because that corrupt leader or that ethnic group is dominating the economy. And that's not a question of resources. That's a question of politics. Now, will the growth of Africa's population deplete its resources? It certainly does not have to. There are large reserves of arable land in Africa that are not irrigated, not fertilized, or have problems like tsetse fly or other disease infestations, so they're not effectively used. Those can all be overcome. If African lands are cleared, drained, fertilized, the possible productivity for food is quite considerable. Not to mention the fact that our big problem in the world today is obesity, more than malnutrition, for about 70% of the world's population. My big concern about natural resources is that the growing middle class will want more air conditioning, television, bright lighting, projectors, and more meat, especially beef. I don't mind if they want chicken so much, but if they want to eat beef, we've got a problem. Because right now, we're nearing the limit of the water, energy, and beef is a horrible food. And you talk about if people don't want, you don't need to eat beef to be rich, but it's kind of a status symbol, and people enjoy it. Americans are the worst. Have steaks for breakfast. But beef is one of the most wasteful ways to turn energy into food. And so if the world becomes more vegetarian or even less beef, we can get away with a lot fewer resources than we do now. Now, the future may lie in synthetic beef, right? So scientists can come up with a way to print reasonable tasting muscles. There are 3 or 4 different research groups around the world doing synthetic biology to try and create edible proteins that resemble meat from plant products. And it's close. It's actually, I think, closer than commercial solar energy for large scale. So maybe in 10 years, we won't have to worry about raising beef or chicken or pork. We'll just grow it in commercial vats like we brew beer, and that'll be fine. And you can have meat and beer for dinner, and that won't be a problem. The bigger problem is distribution, because if people don't have jobs and they don't have incomes, then they won't be able to afford any kind of meat. They won't be able to afford any kind of energy. And what's happening in Africa now is that development is focused on urban centers, natural resources, and government. And none of those create a large amount of jobs. So the job creation and average incomes in Africa are not growing with the overall growth of the economy. Most of the gains are going to a small urban capital elite and government.
What's your projection about the development of the Scottish independent movement? Because to me, it seems a classical or typical example of the class struggles. Yeah. The young ones want more self-control, want more say in their own of the future. But then the established one or the middle class want economic stability, want their property protected. Yeah. So this may share a lot of lessons for other democracies.
Well, I think one of the things you point to is the role of youthful confidence and exuberance. What has happened in Scotland is a kind of discovery of pride in Scotland. Now, part of that is strange politics, that Scotland was quite loyal to Britain and the political system. 20 years ago, for example, in Scotland, Labour and Conservative parties were about equal in their votes. But 2 things happened in the last 30, 40 years, and that is the Labour Party got stronger and stronger in Scotland because the Scottish people, for a number of historical reasons, they tend to be more egalitarian. So they didn't like the policies of the Conservatives that were more about allow more inequality in order to promote growth. The Scots were more, we need to preserve greater social equality. So they gravitated to Labour. So Scotland started voting more and more Labour. And that was okay when the Labour Party was strong. But when the Labour Party got very weak and ineffective and kind of went off the rails, the Scots were kind of, well, we don't want to vote Tory, so what do? We want to be Scots. So the Scottish Nationalist Party started gaining strength. It hasn't been a constant, but it was surprisingly strong in the last election. Now this can all disappear because it's not based, as you say, on some strong divergence. A lot of it is a feeling of identity that may pass if Scotland does very well. I mean, the Conservatives say we're going to give all kinds of benefits to Scotland and maybe they'll work. I don't know. But I want to raise this in terms of South Korea. South Korea, for a long time, was kind of a defensive, inward-looking place. And under the military regimes, they were preoccupied with recovery from the devastation of the Korean War, Japanese occupation. They wanted to make Korea strong. And for a long time, Korea was kind of a gray, faceless, industrial place. Reminded me of Chicago in the old days. But in the last 20 years or so, South Korea has emerged as a vibrant culture capital, right? Everyone across Asia loves K-pop and Korean fashion and Korean soap opera and TV. Where did that come from, right? It used to be, Hong Kong culture and Hong Kong films. And so where did South Korea get this? Well, a lot of it is being confident, enjoying their own culture, but also not being so defensive. Enjoying a greater quality of life is infectious. And a lot of the K-pop and the soap operas, a lot of the Korean culture is celebrating how much better life has become in Korea in the last 20, 30 years. More interesting, more choices, more cosmetics, more beauty, more urban design. In Moscow, the first big new luxury hotel to open in Moscow in many years is, can you guess? It's Korean, the LAPP. Right? The LAPP Hotel has become the new big prestige hotel for getting married in Moscow. Is a Korean hotel. Why? Because they have, in a sense, perfected the highest level of glamour and luxury of hotel chains. Right? So the point you raise just leads me to reflect on success. So whether, the United States has kind of lost its mojo, right? But whether Hong Kong can recover it depends a lot on, is Hong Kong going to get bogged down in fighting over, do we fight with the mainland or do we work with it? Do we accept inequality or do something about it? Do we deal with pollution or not? If Hong Kong starts to feel really good about having succeeded in providing a better quality of life and encouraging people to be innovative and creative and thoughtful and different, then you could have that same kind of burst of happy identity that Korea is enjoying now and that Scotland is kind of enjoying and that other places have had at different times. But right now you're kind of on the edge. This fight over democracy and fight over inequality really risks bogging Hong Kong down. So I'm hoping Hong Kong finds its solutions and becomes a happy place again. Quality of government is important in that. Please.
In your projection, because in the future you are see the Asian country like the Indonesia and the Philippines is having a very fast population growth,
right,
and also in the Africa. So, what is the projection in the future? Compare these two economies, would the Africa grow faster or the Asia grow faster?
Very good question. As you know, in the 1960s, economists thought that Africa would be the big success and that Asia would be economically behind. Probably one of the worst forecasts in history, but didn't damage the economics profession any. They can make all kinds of wrong forecasts and still be fine. But the belief was that because Africa had natural resources and growing populations and access, close proximity to European markets and colonial history with good government implanted by Europe, all those things would lead Africa to succeed. The reality, of course, was that after decolonization, the African governments kind of imploded, military coups, rebellions, ethnic fights, and the natural resources turned out to be much less important than human capital for economic prosperity. Meanwhile, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, with very few natural resources, invested very heavily in human capital, built really good educational systems, engineering expertise, trade, economic expertise, and decided that they would tackle export markets head on. Didn't matter that East Asia was far from America and Europe. Thanks to container ships, you could move exports around the world very cheaply. So Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they all focused on competitive, capital-intensive, well-designed exports, and they did very well. And Africa collapsed. So the Philippines was expected to be the leader in all of Asia for the same reason. Philippines had natural resources, close ties to the United States as a colonial power, was supposed to do much better than South Korea. But again, it failed. Bad government, very corrupt government, very weak human capital, right? So the lessons are quite obvious. Will Indonesia and Philippines and Vietnam do well, or will Africa do well? Depends entirely on how well they educate their population, how well their government provides order, security, and rule of law to their economies. I don't know whether the Philippines or Indonesia will succeed. I don't know within Africa which countries will succeed. I think Ethiopia will do very well. Ghana, maybe. It's hard to tell because the ethnic problems, are they really solved or are they not? Parts of Nigeria, southern Nigeria seems to be on a good track. Northern Nigeria is the worst disaster in Africa. So it's very hard to tell. So the answer I will give you is conditional. And the same thing is also true for Hong Kong. Hong Kong now educates a smaller proportion of the college-age population through college than Singapore or Korea. I think in Singapore and Korea, it's about 55–60% of college-age people go to college, whereas in Hong Kong, I think it's about 45%. So whichever country does a better job in preparing its population for high productivity jobs, creating an investment climate that attracts capital to produce high productivity jobs, those are the ones that will do best. So it's a question that has many answers. We just don't know which one will be realized.
Professor, you just mentioned Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. What are your views on the AIB? Do you think
What are my views on the AIB?
AIB?
Yeah.
Do you think it's a survival for the IMF, World Bank, or Asian Development Bank?
So the question's about the new Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. I think it's a great idea. I think clearly it has a political as well as an economic motivation. But I think it was necessary because the Asian Development Bank has become a bit moribund and underfinanced. The needs for infrastructure in Asia are very large, much larger than are being met by the Asian Development Bank. I think the International Monetary Fund, other people have said this, by refusing to choose a third world leader for either the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, that made it inevitable that some third world group was going to propose their own alternative. So I think it's both necessary and reasonable. I think the United States should have asked to join. I think it was a terrible strategic blunder by the United States to say, we'll stay out of it, because this bank will have to conform to some degree to international accounting principles to attract capital. The United States was worried that, if China's doing this, it won't work because the currency's not convertible, they don't know how to assure this. Well, the whole point is if the US joins and shows China how to make an institution work that conforms to international best practice, that could have a positive influence on China. But by staying out of it, we make it look to everyone like it's just an ideological fight and that we think China's dangerous and we don't want to support it. It's terrible stuff. But it's understandable given how dysfunctional the US is today. I hope that the bank will contribute to infrastructure. I hope it will conform to best practice for accounting and transparency. It would be a terrible, terrible waste if the if this new infrastructure development bank were to waste funds and become subject to corruption and mismanagement. I hope that does not happen. Can we go on for a few more minutes? How much time do we have? Okay.
Yeah, the China's One Belt, One Road idea is very much focused in linking up the Southern and Central Asia. Now, since the Africa, it can play a very big part in the economic growth of the world. So in your view, should this One Belt, One Road plan be adjusted strategically to link up to Africa as well, or to help them to be more able to contribute to the economic growth of the world?
Yeah. I'm going to give you a complicated answer, okay? Complicated answer is, despite the demographic trends that I've shown you, the value of the African market will still remain small relative to the value of the Asian market. I did a projection recently. If you look at the purchasing power of Europeans age 45 to age 70, that market segment is going to grow very fast for the next 25 years, right? The older Europeans. They tend to have a lot of money. The young people don't. The young people are not in good shape, so that's a bad consumer market. But middle-aged to elderly Europeans will be a very wealthy and large market in the future. On the other hand, in Africa, because incomes are so low, even if they grow rapidly, the total purchasing power of the African market is still going to be fairly slow. So even the Nigerian market as a whole will remain smaller than just the European older population. And in fact, Nestle just pulled out of Africa. I don't know if you saw Nestle milk and chocolate. They decided, this middle class in Africa that everybody told us was going to appear is just not there. Even in Russia, they define middle class as an income of $500 to $1,000 a month. But in the rest of the world, poverty is $2 to $3 a day. If you make more than $3 a day, by some definitions, you're middle class. But that's still not much of a consumption market, okay? So for the road, if the purpose of the One Belt, One Road is to provide a link between China's production and its markets, it's got to go through Asia into Europe. That's the only thing that makes sense. However, to the extent that China also needs raw materials from Africa, part of the One Belt, One Road will have to go in that direction. And although Europe will be the biggest market for the next 20 years, beyond that, if China wants to have a big market for itself in 2050 and beyond, it's going to have to put resources into development in Africa. And so I would say the One Belt, One Road should have kind of two termini. For the next 20 years, the consumer market in Europe is still the biggest pot to enjoy. But for the next 40 to 50 years, the African investment framework, including education, infrastructure, mining, development, all of that then becomes much more important after Europe kind of slows down. Should we close up? We're supposed to go 5 or 5:30 today.
We'll have Professor GOLDSTONE with us again
Yeah.
Wednesday morning.
I will inflict myself upon you one more time.
So after this, we'll find that my introduction was far from being excessive. On the contrary, it was inadequate. So let us thank Professor GOLDSTONE.
Thank you.